An important community-level interaction that we can discuss is the trophic structure of an ecosystem. The trophic structure is an answer to the question, who eats whom in this location? Who eats who in this ecosystem? So remember, the community is all of the living organisms in a given area. So it's all of the bacteria in the soil, it's all of the vegetation, it's all of the competitors, it's all of the prey, it's all of the predators, everything in that location. And then the trophic structure is just analyzing the feeding relationships that exist within that community. Now, a trophic structure helps us to determine the passage of energy and nutrients through this ecosystem. All of the energy has to originally come from the sun. The sun is the sole abiotic energy source for ecosystems on the planet. There is a small exception for hydrothermal vents in deep sea rifts, but apart from mentioning it right now, I'm never going to mention it again, so we can just simplify and say that the sun is the ultimate energy source for all ecosystems. Now, sunlight can be captured by photosynthetic organisms, and they are able to take that non-living energy, that abiotic energy, that radiant sunlight energy, and they're able to convert it over to something that other organisms can use. They can convert it to chemical potential energy. In the case of photosynthesis, what they are doing is capturing the energy of sunlight, and then they are locking it away into sugars, and then the sugars can be metabolized later on. But this means that the amount of energy available to an ecosystem is limited. It's limited by how much sunlight hits that ecosystem. It's limited by how many plants are in that ecosystem. And the number of plants is limited by the number of nutrients, by the amount of space, all these kind of things. So if you don't have enough plants to support a certain number of herbivores, then you're not going to have a very diverse community. You're not going to have a lot of organisms living in that area. And if there's not enough herbivores, you can't have very many carnivores either. So the plants are really what's going to control this ecosystem. Now that's true of the ecosystem on the left. We have two food chains here. The trophic structure is a food chain. So at the very, very bottom of these two food chains, we have plants, which we're very familiar with. This is a terrestrial ecosystem, a land-based forest ecosystem, kind of like the ones we would have around here. And then on the right-hand side, we have an aquatic ecosystem, phytoplankton. So these are not plants, these are protists, but they too are photosynthetic organisms, and they are able to capture sunlight energy. These organisms that do photosynthesis, we have a couple of different names for them. Sometimes we call them producers, because they are the ones that are actually able to capture that sunlight energy and produce chemical potential energy for other organisms to use. But sometimes we call them autotrophs. Autotrophs, self-feeder, right? An automobile is something that is able to propel itself, right? Auto means self, and troph means feeder. And you can take that idea of troph meaning feeder and take a look at this term, trophic structure, the feeding structure of this ecosystem. So these are called producers because they are the ones that are able to capture non-living energy sources, sunlight, and then lock it into organic molecules for other organisms to use. Everything else in the ecosystem is called a consumer. It's some kind of a consumer. Consumers also have a fancy name. We call them heterotrophs. And we arrange them into different categories here. We have our primary consumers. Primary consumers. And they're the herbivores. They're the ones that eat the plants that have captured the energy, or the phytoplankton that's captured the energy. Here we have a grasshopper, which is acting as an herbivore, and over on this side we have zooplankton acting as herbivores. So this is why we would say primary consumer, because herbivore kind of implies that you eat plants, but phytoplankton is not a plant, and yet the zooplankton and the grasshopper are occupying the same level in their respective trophic structures. So we would say primary consumers rather than herbivores. Next up, we have the individuals that eat the herbivores, right? Your carnivores. Now, in the case of mice, they're actually omnivores. They can eat lots of different things, but for right now, they are fulfilling the role, the ecological role, of a carnivore. So you have organisms that eat the primary consumer, and the ones that eat the primary consumers we call secondary consumers. The ones that eat the secondary consumers, you can see where this is going, are called tertiary consumers. So in the case of the aquatic ecosystem, we went from phytoplankton to primary consumers, that's our zooplankton, to secondary consumers, those are our small fish here, they eat the primary consumers, to our tertiary consumers, who eat the secondary consumers, right? If you eat a secondary consumer, you are a tertiary consumer. Over here, the snake is our tertiary consumer. And then finally, we go to what you might call an apex predator, apex predators. And these are going to be the ones that do that they feed on other things in the ecosystem, and they don't really have any predators that prey on them. But you might wonder why. Why isn't there anything that preys on an orca whale? Why isn't there anything that preys on this red-tailed hawk here? And interestingly, the answer actually has to do with the amount of energy available to that particular ecosystem. Every day, the sun provides an amount of energy to Earth equal to 100 million atomic bombs. However, that is distributed over the entire surface area of the planet. So if we take a look at a single ecosystem, it's going to have a defined amount of space. Here I've drawn an island floating out in the middle of the ocean. Let's assume that the island has a surface area of 1 kilometer squared. Because the island has a finite size, the amount of energy delivered to that island on a daily basis is also going to be finite, measurable, limited. And the surface area of the island is also going to limit how many plants are on that island, so the amount of photosynthesis that can take place is also limited. In this diagram, for every 10,000 kilocalories of solar energy provided by the sun, only 1,000 kilocalories is captured by the plants. That's 10% energy capture. That's actually a generous amount because the reality is that plants only capture 1% of solar energy in the form of primary production. As producers capture solar energy, they increase in size, they grow, they make more biomass. Only the biomass is passed on to future trophic levels, so only the energy that is actually stored inside the plant material becomes available for herbivores to consume. The remainder of the energy is going to be reflected off as visible light, or it's going to be lost through inefficiencies or heat, and in total, only a small fraction of that sunlight is going to be captured by the primary producers. But that is all of the energy available to this ecosystem. Now, the 1,000 kilocalories stored inside this plant material is all the food that's available for the next trophic level, which is the primary consumers, your herbivores. As the primary consumers eat the producers, they have to store some of that energy as their own biomass. However, they can't get 100% of them. Some of that energy has to be used for the work of moving around or just keeping the body going, keeping the metabolism running strong, and some of it has to be excreted out as waste. Typically, only 5 to 20% of the total energy consumed is actually going to be stored in the biomass of these primary consumers. And again, only the biomass is available as energy for the next trophic level up. In this diagram, I'm using a 10% transfer between levels in order to keep the math nice and simple. An important implication of this stepwise decline of energy in a trophic structure is that the amount of energy available to top-level consumers is small compared with the amount of energy available to lower-level consumers. Only a tiny fraction of the energy stored by photosynthesis flows through a food chain all the way up to secondary or tertiary consumers. And that explains why top-level consumers such as lions or bears require so much geographic territory. It takes a lot of vegetation to support trophic levels so many steps removed from these photosynthetic primary producers. By the time we move up from our primary consumer herbivore, the goat, up to our secondary consumer carnivore, this bear, there's only 10 kilocalories left for the bear to add to its own biomass from the original 10,000 provided to this island by the sun. But wait, I hear you say, there's no way that 10 calories is enough for a bear to live on. I need 2,000 calories and I'm much smaller than a bear. And you're correct. The number of trophic levels that an ecosystem can support is related to how much primary production it has. Since this is such a small island, we couldn't sustain a bear population. If we wanted to feed bears, the bear would need more territory, so we would probably need several islands worth of plants in order to get enough energy up to the bear, up to the secondary consumer. This fact is related to another concept I'll talk about later, which is when humans eat vegetables, we are behaving as primary consumers, and when we eat meat, we are behaving as secondary consumers. And when we behave as secondary consumers, it requires more land area in order to support that diet. Now that might not sound so bad, but the reality is that one of the driving factors of habitat destruction across the planet is the clearing of land to make more space for ranches and farms in order to grow food for more livestock, and then more prairie for livestock to be able to move around on. We'll talk more about those types of effects a little bit later on in this unit. I suppose I should have mentioned before the example that we just did on the blackboard that a kilocalorie is a dietary calorie. When you look at the back of a cereal box and it says that 1 cup of this cereal contains 250 calories, physics-wise it contains 250 kilocalories. They just created a new unit called calorie with a capital C in order to save a little bit of space on the back of the box. So it's the same thing. Say that this leaf contains 100 kilocalories of energy inside of it. You probably know that a pound of leaves, like lettuce, is not going to have the same number of calories as a pound of ground beef. And part of the reason for that is that plants are mostly cellulose and water, stuff that we can't get a lot of calories out of. Now, some organisms are herbivores, and they have bacteria in their gut that help them get some of that energy out, but not all of it still. So 50 kilocalories from this leaf are going to be excreted as waste. It's never going to be processed by this caterpillar's body at all. Another 35 are going to go to cellular respiration. That means that it's breathing out, right? CO2 is leaving. And why is it doing cellular respiration? Well, it wants to power itself, right? That goes to the power of moving around, keeping its blood circulating, although insects wouldn't have blood, they would have hemolymph. Just general homeostasis. It requires energy, and a lot of that energy comes from the food that they have. So then what is this 10%, or in this case 15%, energy captured that I'm talking about? The remaining 15% is what actually goes in order to build up this caterpillar's muscles. It's what allows it to grow and put on size. Right? There's energy stored inside your fats. There's energy stored inside your muscles. There's energy stored inside the carbohydrates that you find inside your body. This 15% of energy remaining from the food is where that energy comes from inside of your body. And if a bird comes by and eats this caterpillar, only this energy, the biomass, is going to be available to that bird as its own nutrition source. All of this, right? All of this energy here, that is not available to secondary consumers. Okay, so we lose energy at each link of the food chain. So let's test your understanding. I have a very simple trophic structure for an ecosystem. This is the ecosystem of my yard. So we have all of this grass here, or clover would probably have been more appropriate. And all this grass is going to be eaten by this groundhog right here, and the groundhog is going to be eaten by a fox. There was a family of groundhogs living under my shed last year, and now there's a family of foxes living under my shed, so I think something trophic may have been occurring there. So what's the question? What trophic level does the fox occupy in the food chain above? Take a moment, write down your answer. We're talking primary consumer, producer, what level does it occupy? And I'll give you the answer in a moment. The correct answer is that the fox is occupying the position of secondary consumer because it is eating the primary consumer, and this groundhog is the primary consumer because it eats the producers. The next question is, how much energy will be available to the fox, assuming that in my entire yard there is 1,350 kilocalories of energy? Go ahead and assume that it's a 10% transfer with each transition. So write out your number. Okay, so if we assume that there were 1,350 kilocalories in my lawn, then this groundhog got 10% of that energy stored in its biomass. Everything else was lost, but it got 135. That's probably not enough to sustain a groundhog, so that's why it goes over to my neighbor's yards to look for food as well. But from my yard, the groundhog got 135 of those kilocalories stored inside its biomass. Right? And then the fox, when it eats the groundhogs, only 13.5 kilocalories would be stored inside that fox. By now, I'm guessing some of you have thought, what about omnivores? Where do they fit in this trophic structure? And the reality is that trophic structures are not as neat and simple as the food chain would suggest. Rather, what we have is an integrated network of food chains all kind of mixed together, which we call the food web. So here you can see that there are birds, which are omnivores in this chart. They are eating cactus flowers, but they also eat some of the insects that live on these cactuses. So that would put them as omnivores. For trophic structure diagrams, what you do with omnivores is you put them at the highest level that they feed at. So since this bird eats plants, but it also eats the insects which eat the plants, we put it up at the same level as the secondary consumers here. So we put it way up on this diagram. And food webs are just a more sophisticated way to look at trophic structure because it acknowledges that, for example, groundhogs might have a more diverse diet than just eating the grass or clover on my yard. There are so many different species in every ecosystem, and the interactions between them are complicated. Then we have the organisms who eat at multiple trophic levels, not because they're great predators, but because they're simply less discerning about their next lunch. Whatever they can take, they will get. In this category, we have detritivores, or scavengers, so it's things like vultures and jackals, stuff that will just kind of walk around looking for a free meal, a carcass left behind from some other predator, and because they'll eat just about anything that they can find, they really don't fit neatly into those trophic charts either. Now, that said, they would still be a kind of consumer, just in its own category called detritivore. Another category of Death Eater, as I like to call them, are the decomposers, prokaryotes and fungi. They secrete enzymes that digest organic molecules in whatever it is they're growing on top of. They're still consumers. I mean, they're not producers. They can't do photosynthesis, but they just grow on top of whatever it is that they are consuming. And the great thing about decomposers is that their waste, what they leave behind, is nutrient-rich soil. So they do the work of taking all of these complex organic molecules that all of the other organisms have spent time building up and returning them back to an inorganic state, returning it back into compost, essentially. And then plants can use that material in order to start building themselves back up again. So decomposers are an incredibly important part of every ecosystem. At this point, it should be clear that any predator is going to have to eat lots and lots and lots of prey in order to sustain their body. There's just so much energy lost in between trophic levels that the only way that predators can get around it is by eating a large amount of biomass. But just because 90% of the energy is lost between trophic levels, that doesn't mean that 90% of everything is lost. Some materials adhere very, very strongly to biological tissues. So for instance, mercury mercury, which is probably a material you've heard of. Mercury is a metal with no biological function, and indeed it is toxic. It's a neurotoxin. It can mess up your nervous system if you get too much mercury in you, and that's actually where the term mad as a hatter comes from. But this video is running a little long already, so I'll skip that anecdote for right now. So, since mercury can bind to biological tissue, if there's a small amount of mercury in all of these prey out here, every single one of these prey has a very tiny trace amount of mercury, well, when this predator eats all of those prey to meet his energy requirements, he's going to receive all of that mercury. Okay? And that means that there will be a much higher concentration of mercury in the predator than there was at the prey. You actually increase the amount of certain toxins as you move up trophic levels. Here's another example in a food chain. PCBs. PCBs are an environmental toxin that humans created as part of electrical circuits. It was kind of an insulating material for electrical circuits, and it's been banned for a while because it's been discovered that it might have some ill effects on human health. But it got out into the environment, and the phytoplankton, the producers, right? The producers absorbed some of those PCBs, and then they were eaten by the zooplankton. And the zooplankton had to eat a lot of phytoplankton in order to meet their calorie needs. So the zooplankton ended up with a higher concentration of these PCBs than the phytoplankton had, right? 0.025 parts per million, and then whoof, we move right up to about 5 times the concentration, 1.23 parts per million. And then the zooplankton, they're eaten by small fish, our secondary consumers, and those small fish then were found to have concentrations of this pollutant 10 times higher than that of the zooplankton. Those fish were eaten by larger fish, 5 times the concentration, and then these large lake fish, they were eaten by apex predators, birds in this case, and they ended up with a massive amount of this toxin in their system. This is called biological magnification, or biomagnification, or bioaccumulation, if you like. Some environmental toxins, not all of them, some environmental toxins accumulate in consumers at higher concentrations as we move up trophic levels. Now, there's lots of good examples of biomagnification, which I'll use later on, like DDT is the kind of classic example. But the question might be, why is biological magnification important to humans? So let's consider mercury for a moment. Mercury is a byproduct of burning coal. It releases methylmercury out into the atmosphere, and then that mercury settles into aquatic ecosystems. And then the phytoplankton, just like in the example we had a moment ago, pick up that mercury, and then they are eaten by zooplankton, onto secondary consumers, tertiary consumers, on and on, until you get to some of these top-tier predators. And tuna are very big fish. They're a pretty high-level predator in their ecosystem. So, what happens to the mercury? Well, it bioaccumulates in the tissue of these tuna. Have you ever heard someone warn you not to eat too much fish because you might get mercury poisoning? Well, the fish aren't producing mercury. Again, mercury has no biological function. We put the mercury out in the ecosystems, and then it biomagnified up the food chain. So this is something that should be a concern to us, that we're putting out pollutants into the ecosystem. Eventually, some of those pollutants can come back and find us again when we buy things at the grocery store. Biomagnification is one route in which some of these pollutants can actually come back to us more concentrated than we put them out in the first place. As this very scientific diagram illustrates, humans are a very top-level predator, eating just about anything that takes their fancy, so we should absolutely be concerned about things like biomagnification and other environmental problems.